I never thought I'd leave the city. The constant hum of traffic, the buzzing fluorescent lights, the neighbor upstairs hammering on his guitar at 3 in the morning. It all felt oppressive, but predictable. I'd convinced myself I needed a break, a real escape, and Vermont had called with a Craigslist ad promising a rustic cabin in a quiet town. One that practically begged me to trade the chaos for stillness. It seemed too good to be true, but I didn't care. The idea of serenity, of snow-dusted streets and open spaces had become irresistible. The drive was 6 hours long, each mile taking me deeper into an unfamiliar countryside where the trees began to crowd the road and the asphalt seemed to thin out into gravel. The GPS signal gave up 3 miles outside the town of Hollow Creek, leaving me with only a crumpled, hand-drawn map from the rental site. My phone had lost service long ago, and I realized that I was utterly, completely alone. The sun was starting to sink behind bare winter branches, casting long skeletal shadows over the snow-streaked ground. Hollow Creek didn't look like a town. It looked like a stage set frozen decades ago, with peeling paint, shuttered windows, and streets untouched by footprints. The cabin was at the end of a winding gravel path, a 2-story salt box with faded green shutters and a sagging porch. The structure was intact, but there was something about it that felt defeated. Not abandoned exactly, but spiritually exhausted. I parked and took in the silence. Not the quiet of snow, which is soft and forgiving, but the oppressive absence of life. No wind stirred the branches. No birds called. No distant hum of civilization. My ears rang. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and something faintly sweet, like old fruit rotting somewhere in the corner. The furnishings were Spartan. The living room, a bare rectangle with a stone fireplace. The kitchen lined with yellowed linoleum, and the bathroom stuck in the 1970s. A narrow staircase led upstairs, and a single bare bulb cast shadows that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of my own heartbeat. The radiators clanged feebly, barely pushing lukewarm air into the room. And somewhere within the walls, a persistent drip echoed like a slow, deliberate warning. It was nearly 4 in the afternoon when I first heard the footsteps on the porch. That shouldn't have surprised me. The rental agreement had promised seclusion. But there they were, heavy, deliberate, confident steps that crunched over the gravel outside. I approached the window, trying to convince myself it was a neighbor, a local checking the property. That's when I saw her. An elderly woman, late 60s, hair pulled back so tight it stretched her pale skin, and a long wool coat worn at the elbows. She carried a canvas bag that bulged in unnatural angles. She didn't smile, didn't hesitate. She walked straight to the porch and set the bag down with a thump that vibrated through the floorboards. "You're the city man renting the Fairchild place," she said. No introduction, no pleasantries. Her blue eyes swept over me with the precision of a farmer evaluating livestock. "Yes," I said cautiously. "I'm Elias, renting for the month. And you?" Her gaze hardened. "I'm here because it is my duty. The compact requires it." She said the word compact with a weight I didn't understand at first. A capital C that seemed to carry centuries of unspoken threat. Then she began pulling items from the canvas bag. Shoes. 13 of them, miniature, wooden, each palm-sized. They were crude, worn, splintered. Traces of color still clinging to the surface. Yet their presence was commanding. "Mrs. Gable, what are these?" "Be quiet," she snapped. Her voice left no room for argument. "Read these, memorize them. Follow them exactly. Every year, no exceptions. The compact comes due on December 23rd and 24th. The last renter ignored the rules. They found him on Christmas morning. Pieces." Her face went gray as she remembered. She handed me a yellowed parchment covered in cramped handwriting. The edges were brittle, stained. It listed the rules of the Hollow Creek Compact, bound to the town and its 13 mysterious lads. The instructions were precise and unnerving. The shoes must remain on the porch, left untouched until sunrise on the 25th. Failure to follow the rituals would result in consequences too horrifying to comprehend, rewards too miraculous to risk. I laughed nervously, convincing myself this was a local custom, a quirky tradition to scare city folk. But something in Mrs. Gable's eyes, the taut lines of her face, spoke of truths far older than town gossip. She didn't need to finish. Her fear said enough. Night fell quickly in Hollow Creek. The forest surrounding the cabin became a wall of black. My first night was the Feast of Grease, a ritual involving food left unwashed for scavengers I couldn't see. I made grilled cheese, leaving butter and grease across pans and counters exactly as instructed. And then I waited. The silence thickened, growing tactile, pressing against my ears and chest. Minutes turned into hours. The clacking started first. Wood on wood, deliberate and precise. Something was moving the shoes. 7 figures, pale, grotesque, thin-limbed, humanoid, yet alien, were on the porch. They inspected each shoe, measured, confirmed. Then they entered the cabin, gliding through the air with impossible movements, their gray flesh glistening under the dim light, their tongues extended, unnaturally long, tasting every smear of butter, every remnant of food left behind. I pressed myself against the corner of the living room, silent, invisible, obeying the rules to survive. Hours passed. The kitchen smelled of copper and rot, a horror that would linger in my mind forever. Yet the creatures worked with methodical precision, leaving the space cleaner than it had ever been. The parchment's instructions were not exaggeration, they were survival. I felt primal terror in my bones, every instinct screaming at me to flee. But I stayed. By dawn, the creatures evaporated, leaving no trace of themselves except the 13 shoes now filled with silver ash. I took a pinch to my tongue as instructed, and a wave of vitality and clarity washed over me. Exhaustion, pain, fear, all vanished. I had survived night 1. The morning light revealed Hollow Creek as a town returned to normal, or as normal as it could be. The oppressive weight lifted, yet the feeling that the town and its rules were watching lingered, and night too loomed. Night came faster than I expected. The sun barely touched the horizon before Hollow Creek dissolved into darkness, the snow reflecting a dim, unnatural glow under the street lamps. I tried to keep myself busy, stacking firewood, checking the windows, avoiding the unnatural silence. But the cabin seemed alive, and not in a comforting way. The walls exhaled cold air. The floorboards groaned like tired bones. And outside, the trees shifted in ways that made no sense in the absence of wind. I couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Gable's words. The phrase, "the compact comes due." I had no idea what that meant exactly, only that ignoring it would bring consequences far worse than fear. My mind circled back to the shoes. The 13 shoes, now filled with silver ash, sat neatly on the porch like soldiers awaiting orders. Every instinct screamed at me to remove them, to hide, to throw them into the woods. But I didn't. The rules demanded compliance, and the rules were survival. Dinner was uneventful. I prepared nothing, ate nothing, but I kept busy pretending normalcy. Hollow Creek had a rhythm of its own, and I was a guest in its ritualistic heartbeat. As the clock approached midnight, I began the second rule, the candle vigil. According to the parchment, I was to light 13 candles in the windows, each aligned precisely with the stars visible above the forest. Any deviation would bring wrath upon the town, though I still didn't understand why. I arranged the candles, the melted wax sticking to the windowsills, each flame trembling with my own shaking hands. Outside, the shadows lengthened, bending into shapes that shouldn't exist. I saw forms moving between the trees, small hunched figures, probably children if I were rational. Yet their movements were deliberate, purposeful, as if they had been rehearsing for centuries. My breath caught in my throat. Then the knocking began. Soft at first, polite almost, but deliberate. A knock at every window. I froze. It wasn't rhythmical. It wasn't human. It was the sound of time itself, tapping, measuring, judging. I gripped the nearest candle, watching the shadows twist, and slowly the figures emerged. Not children, not entirely human. Tall, thin, elongated limbs, eyes glowing faintly like coals smoldering in ash. They didn't speak, but their gaze carried weight, expectation, and a message. Compliance or obliteration. I obeyed the parchment. I didn't move. I didn't breathe too loudly. I followed every instruction, each gesture meticulous and deliberate, afraid that even the smallest misstep would end me. One figure approached the door and extended its hand. Not in a human way, not invitingly, but in a silent demand. My fingers shook as I offered the shoes from the porch, placing them exactly as described. 3 steps to the left, 1 inch apart, facing east. The creature examined them, nodding slowly. Another appeared at the candle, its long brittle fingers brushing the flame without extinguishing it. I couldn't comprehend how. Physics itself seemed irrelevant here. The others moved silently, inspecting, correcting, measuring, ensuring the rules were followed exactly. Hours passed, though time didn't feel linear. The figures vanished as suddenly as they appeared, leaving behind a silence so deep it was deafening. I slumped against the wall, trembling, utterly exhausted. The parchment indicated that surviving the candle vigil was only part of the compact. The following night, the ritual of offerings was far more dangerous. I spent the next day in a daze, reluctant to leave the cabin, yet compelled to observe the town. Hollow Creek seemed normal during the day. children playing in the snow, neighbors greeting each other warmly, dogs barking, chimneys smoking. Everything about the town screamed ordinary, yet the memory of last night gnawed at me. I noticed subtle oddities. Every house had exactly 13 windows illuminated, small carvings in the trees that looked like faces frozen in mid-scream. And the townsfolk avoided my eyes when I walked past. They didn't speak of the compact, yet their silence was deafening, a warning and a reassurance all at once. By evening, I prepared the offerings, small items of personal significance, left outside the cabin in an exact arrangement. The parchment instructed me to leave a piece of clothing, a coin, a photograph, and a morsel of food at each corner of the yard. I didn't understand why, but the instructions were absolute. I could feel the air grow heavier as I worked, each movement weighted with dread. Snow fell in slow, deliberate flakes, each landing silently, muting even the faintest sound. The ritual of offerings began with a low hum that vibrated through the earth itself. The figures emerged from the trees again, silent, their elongated limbs carrying my offerings with care. Their movements were meticulous, almost reverential. As they circled the yard, I realized the offerings weren't just inspected. They were absorbed, or perhaps judged. My breath caught when one approached the photograph I had left, tilting its head, studying it, and then placing it against its chest. I couldn't tell if it was acknowledgement, approval, or something far worse. Suddenly, one of the figures stepped into the cabin, something it had never done before. The rules didn't mention entry inside, only observation and manipulation of the items outside. My heart pounded as it moved toward me, stopping inches from my face. Its glowing eyes studied me, piercing and calculating, and for a moment, I felt as though my entire being was transparent, laid bare for inspection. I thought of fleeing, but instinct screamed that any motion could trigger consequences. I held my position, hands trembling, trying to appear still, calm, compliant. Then it leaned closer, and in a voice like gravel sliding over stone, it whispered, "Do not forget the final night, the shrouded feast. All else is preparation." And just like that, it was gone, dissolving into the shadows of the porch as if it had never existed. I spent the rest of the night sleepless, haunted not by fear alone, but by the incomprehensible weight of expectation. The rules weren't arbitrary. They were living, breathing, demanding. And Hollow Creek was alive, in ways that made no sense. A town bound by rituals older than memory, overseen by beings I could barely comprehend. When dawn broke, I saw the footprints in the snow, hundreds of tiny impressions circling the cabin, leading nowhere and everywhere. The air was thick with a metallic scent, and the snow had been smoothed into unnatural patterns. Geometric, precise, impossible to replicate. I didn't question it. I only noted that compliance had spared me again, though the sense of being observed, judged, never left. I knew the next night would be the shrouded feast, the final night, the culmination of all the rules, all the rituals. Failure would be unthinkable. Survival would depend entirely on my ability to obey without understanding. The night before the shrouded feast arrived with a heavy silence that pressed against my ears like a physical weight. The snow had stopped falling, but the world felt muted, as if the entire town had exhaled and held its breath. I could hear nothing but the occasional creak of the cabin, the wind whispering through the skeletal trees, and the distant, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath Hollow Creek. I tried to keep busy, preparing for the feast. The parchment had outlined the procedures vaguely, but in the kind of ominous detail that leaves more questions than answers. I was to arrange 13 objects, 13 for each household, 13 for each step of compliance, around a central fire pit in the town square. The objects were strange. A feather, a shard of glass, a piece of coal, a tiny carved figurine, a lock of hair, a candle, a scrap of cloth, a rusted key, a coin, a photograph, a bell, a cup, and a small bowl of salt. Each item had to be positioned precisely, measured by steps rather than inches, aligned to the stars in ways I could barely comprehend. Despite the meticulous preparations, I couldn't stop the creeping feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow in the cabin seemed to stretch, bend, and twist toward me. The footprints from the candle vigil and the ritual of offerings had multiplied, hundreds now, forming intricate patterns in the snow that led in impossible directions. I had no idea how the townsfolk navigated their world without getting lost, or if they even needed to. As I trudged toward the town square with my bundle of offerings, I noticed subtle signs of the town's otherworldly nature. Windows flickered despite no lights inside. Tree branches bent unnaturally, and the snow beneath my feet seemed to absorb sound completely. Hollow Creek was alive, watching, judging, preparing me for something far beyond my understanding. The square was empty, yet the air hummed with anticipation. I arranged the objects as instructed, each movement deliberate. My hands numb from cold and fear. With each placement, the wind seemed to shift, carrying whispers that sounded like distant voices speaking in a language I almost recognized, but could not understand. I dared not look around too much, fearing that acknowledgement of the presence behind those whispers might draw attention I couldn't survive. Once the objects were arranged, the fire pit at the center seemed to ignite itself, a pale blue flame rising without smoke or heat. I stepped back, heart pounding, as shadows began to coalesce around the square. Figures emerged, slender, elongated, glowing faintly, far more numerous than before. Their eyes, coals in the dark, scanned the objects, examining, judging, and correcting. One bent a piece of the cloth ever so slightly. Another tapped the coin with a brittle finger. They moved silently, yet the air vibrated with authority. Then the central figure appeared, larger, more imposing, with eyes that burned brighter than the others. It gestured toward me, and instinctively I dropped to my knees. The parchment hadn't mentioned this. It hadn't prepared me for the feeling of being small, entirely exposed, beneath a gaze that seemed to weigh every atom of my being. The figure extended one elongated hand toward the fire pit. The flame surged higher, revealing shapes within, flickering shadows of the town's past, glimpses of families long gone, rituals long forgotten, and, most unsettling, people who looked like me, kneeling, terrified, and failing. The images twisted and morphed with each flicker, leaving me dizzy and nauseous. "You understand the compact," the figure said, its voice a low resonance that vibrated through my bones. "You understand the rules?" I nodded, though my voice had left me. My mind raced. I understood nothing, and yet I understood everything. Survival required obedience, blind and absolute. Failure was not an option. The shadows around the square began to dance, forming patterns and lines that made my head spin. The objects I had placed started to move, shifting ever so slightly, as if guided by unseen hands. I realized then that the town itself, the snow, the wind, the trees, was alive in a way I had never imagined. Hollow Creek wasn't just a town. It was a creature, vast and ancient, sustained by ritual and compliance. Suddenly, a bell rang. not from a church, not from any human source, but from nowhere, vibrating through the air and the ground. The figures froze, and the blue flame at the center leapt higher, illuminating faces that I could barely distinguish. Faces of the townsfolk, perhaps, or of something else entirely. I recognized a few. Children I had seen playing, men and women walking past my cabin. Their eyes were empty, hollow, yet they followed me, acknowledging my presence as if my survival depended on their observation. The central figure spoke again. Tonight, you take the final step, the feast. I had imagined a banquet, food, warmth. What I got was far more unsettling. The ground beneath the fire pit opened slightly, revealing a shallow pit lined with frost-covered stones. I was instructed to kneel, to place my hands into the snow beside the pit, and to leave one final offering, a personal secret, whispered into the air and absorbed by the frost. I hesitated. How could the cold consume a secret? Yet instinct compelled me. I whispered the deepest fear I had held since arriving in Hollow Creek. My inability to survive, my dread of failing, my terror of the unknown. The frost absorbed it, sucking it from my mouth, my throat, my lungs. The wind carried it away, scattering it into the darkness. The figures circled me, moving faster now, forming a ring of shadows and glowing eyes. They murmured in a language that vibrated in my bones, and the objects I had placed seemed to respond, glowing faintly, aligning themselves with invisible markers. The blue flame leapt higher, casting elongated shadows that twisted into shapes I could barely recognize. I realized then that the ritual wasn't about the objects, the candles, or even the shoes. It was about me. The compact demanded acknowledgement, submission, and assimilation. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time had lost meaning. Finally, the figures withdrew, leaving me kneeling beside the frost-lined pit. The blue flame dimmed, and the wind stilled. The silence that followed was absolute, oppressive, yet strangely comforting. I rose slowly, trembling, feeling both empty and full, aware that I had survived. For now, the townsfolk emerged from the shadows, silent but observing, their eyes blank, yet filled with expectation. They led me back to the cabin, each step deliberate, echoing with the weight of countless rituals before mine. I realized that Hollow Creek had accepted me, not because I understood, But because I obeyed, I sat by the fire that night, staring at the shadows dancing along the walls. The rules weren't written for entertainment, for tradition, or for morality. They were survival. Each rule, no matter how strange, was a thread in a tapestry I could never fully see. And I was a part of it now, woven into the fabric of Hollow Creek, bound by ritual, fear, and the compact. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by whispers and shadows, but it came. I dreamed of the figures, the blue flame, the frost pit, and the whispered secrets. I awoke, knowing that I would never leave Hollow Creek entirely. Not physically, and perhaps not mentally. The town had claimed me. I was a survivor, yes, but at a cost I could not yet measure. Morning arrived in Hollow Creek without fanfare, almost imperceptibly. The snow outside my cabin had shifted during the night, forming strange ridges and patterns that seemed deliberate, almost communicative. I stepped outside, and the world felt the same as before. Silent, cold, yet vibrating with that low, constant hum that I could no longer ignore. The town was awake, though none of its residents were visible. Hollow Creek watched, patient and eternal. The rules hadn't ended with the feast. In fact, they had only deepened. I found new instructions waiting on my cabin table, written on parchment as old as the town itself. One by one, they outlined the tasks I was to complete in the coming days. Gifts that must be left outside the neighbors' doors at precise hours. Candles lit in windows, facing the frozen woods. Snow sculptures carved in the shapes dictated by the stars. Footsteps counted and measured in patterns no outsider could predict. Every action reinforced the compact. Every omission risked drawing attention in a way I couldn't survive. I realized something terrifying. The town's rituals weren't just traditions. They were a form of control, a language, a covenant between the land, the spirits, and the people. Compliance meant safety. Resistance meant disappearance, or worse, being absorbed into the shadows themselves. I thought about the blue flame, the frost pit, the figures circling me during the feast. They weren't just watching, they were evaluating, ensuring the compact endured. And I had passed for now. But the town had a way of lingering in one's mind. Even in the warm confines of my cabin, I could feel it pressing against my skull, whispering in languages my subconscious almost understood. Faces from the feast haunted my reflections in the window pane. Every flicker of shadow in the snow seemed deliberate. Every creak in the floorboards a signal. Hollow Creek didn't just exist around me. It existed through me, and perhaps through anyone who dared to step foot within its frozen borders. As Christmas arrived, I followed the rules meticulously. I left the gifts, lit the candles, carved the snow sculptures, and counted my steps precisely. No one spoke to me. No one needed to. Observation alone was enough. The town's gaze was omnipresent, patient, and absolute. Yet I survived. More than survived. I began to feel a strange alignment with the rituals, a perverse comfort in compliance. Fear had become familiarity, and familiarity had become survival instinct. At night, when the blue flame flickered in my dreams, I understood. Hollow Creek wasn't cruel in the way humans could be cruel. It was ancient, deliberate, and exacting. It demanded acknowledgement, respect, and adherence. Its rules were strange, yes, but within that strangeness was order. An order I had glimpsed, and one I could never unsee. I was part of its rhythm now, a participant in a story far older and darker than any I could have imagined. I sometimes wonder if outsiders who stumble into Hollow Creek ever leave, or if they are absorbed into the town's essence, becoming whispers in the wind, shadows in the snow, or faint echoes in the blue flame. I think about the people I glimpsed in the fire pit, kneeling, terrified, and failing. Their secrets became part of Hollow Creek, as my own had. The town feeds on compliance, thrives on ritual, and persists through fear, obedience, and whispers carried by frost and flame. As I step outside to complete my final task, the snow crunching beneath my boots, I feel its eyes on me again. Not threatening, not cruel, but absolute. Hollow Creek is alive, and I am a part of it. There is no leaving, no escaping, only following, surviving, and becoming another thread in its infinite gold and beautiful tapestry. Christmas here is not about joy. It is about acknowledgement, compliance, and the understanding that some places are older than morality, older than time, and more enduring than life itself.